Hi, my name is Dion, and welcome to my chat about the Zodiac Killer's MO development and how we can use it to demonstrate that one person was solely responsible for the four canonical crimes: Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, Lake Berryessa, and Presidio Heights. Initially, I wanted to do nothing more than break down the systematics of the detail provided by the Z408 writer and the subsequent follow-up in an attempt to narrow the suspect pool for authorship. It's naturally evolved into a full script of what I believe drove Zodiac to do the things he did during those fateful few months. I also want to try and show that his signature behaviour shines through the big changes in MO and methodology, and that the latter can be explained by absorbing the exact same material we know Zodiac himself was reading. The question sometimes presented to the community is, was Zodiac truly responsible for Lake Herman Road, or did he simply claim credit for it? Not all of the investigators were convinced that Zodiac was the killer at Lake Herman Road. The mere proposition might seem absurd at first to those not familiar with it, yet the question is nowhere near as ridiculous as it might seem at first glance. When we take a closer look at some of the detail, it becomes clear that what the letter writer offered up was not necessarily information exclusive to somebody at the crime scene. Or was it? In the first section of this essay, we're going to explore the Lake Herman Road question and inspect the content provided, which is meant to constitute facts that only he and the police know. On August the 1st, 1969, the Vallejo newspapers report that many people could have access to the information that the writer had, either by their presence at the crime scene or from overhearing conversations between officers, maybe reporters. There's also a suggestion that the writer was quoting from police reports. I'll explore each of these scenarios and approach them from a boots-on-the-ground perspective. Now, of course, there's absolutely no way we can tell what was going through this guy's mind, but what we can do is work our way through the timeline and see which events could have provoked certain actions and reactions from him. We can look backwards and see which elements of the scenes he might have refined his MO and which mistakes he possibly learned from. By putting ourselves in his shoes and reading the same newspaper articles that he did at the time, we can sense the envy when other crimes were stealing his precious front page slot, relive the fear and anxiety when he reads about Brian and Cecilia being alive in Queen of the Valley Hospital, understand his feeling of power at being back in control when it becomes clear that he had gotten away with riding his luck at Presidio Heights. Walking through the timeline in the killer's shoes exemplifies why I believe there is most likely only one killer/letter writer operating as the Zodiac, and that he is responsible for the canonical crimes commonly attributed to him. It's kind of oxymoronic that we have a killer so desperate to be linked with prior crimes, yet so deliberate in creating enough differences at each scene to keep everybody guessing, even 50 plus years later, as to which ones he was involved in. And I'm not sure that was so much the deliberate actions of a mastermind criminal, as much as a significant slice of luck and the people's attitudes and common assumptions of the times, most pertinently in law enforcement. With all due respect, at that time they had absolutely no idea what they were dealing with. Part 1. Did the Zodiac kill Betty Lou Jensen and David Arthur Faraday? In spite of no acknowledgement or contact prior to July 31st, 1969, the Zodiac refers to the Lake Herman Road consistently as part of his series afterwards. The gear car door, the phone calls, the letters, recalling anniversaries. For example, he sent a letter to Melvin Belli on the 20th December 1969, exactly 1 year after the Lake Herman Road attack. Now, this is not a normal integration when we're considering the inclusion of a hoax, but it's also not impossible for somebody to maintain this level of deceit if they are so invested. Zodiac was certainly invested, so the question we have to ask, is it likely he claimed the Lake Herman Road attack as his own despite not being involved in it? The first mention of any sort of connection is the phone call he made to VPD by the Blue Rock Springs Perp in the early morning of July 5th, 1969. And in this call, while giving directions to where they can find the victims, he mentions, "I also killed those kids last year," clearly referring to the still unsolved Jensen Faraday murders. About 4 weeks later, a trio of bizarre communications arrives at different Bay Area news publications. These letters refer to both Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, the writer claiming to provide some facts which only I plus the police know. Now, these facts are 1. Brand name of ammo Super X. 2. 10 shots were fired. 3. The boy was on his back with his feet to the car. 4. The girl was on her right side, feet to the west. The information about shots fired was reproduced in news articles, and initially they reported less shots, but later articles stated 10. Not hard for a hoaxer to pick this up. We could also say this about the branding, although it was never made public. Super X was by far the most widely used brand of .22 ammunition used. He could have just as easily guessed this fact, or gotten it in a number of ways. This leaves us with the final 2 facts, both pertaining to body position of the victims. They were not made public, so there would only be 3 ways that the writer could possess this knowledge: access to police reports and documents, oversharing/overhearing/loose lips, or being at the crime scene itself. Jack Stilts is quoted in news media at the time saying that anyone could have gotten the information from either being at the scene or overhearing people talk. Having access to police reports has been suggested by some in the amateur online community. Now let's look at each of the possibilities, assuming with each that luck falls the right way, and see where it leads us. Okay, firstly, the police reports. Is it possible that the killer had access to the Solano County Sheriff Office reports for Lake Herman Road and had retrieved these facts from there? Well, let's assume for a moment he did have some form of access to them and that he was lifting his information on the case from that specific source. Upon checking the all-important RO's and IO's reports, he would have discovered that Betty Lou was discovered face down, as described clearly in all of those initial reports. It's not until the 24th of December when Stella Borges is interviewed by Les Lundblad. She relates coming across the scene and states that she saw Betty Lou lying on her side. A very subtle but very important detail, and it is highly likely Betty Lou was still alive at this point, and possibly even when Stella Borges came upon the scene. In death, it seems she has rolled over into the face-down position related by the reporting officers. So, a hoaxer getting his information from the reports would have to have this detail in mind when browsing through what's likely to be hundreds of them. Of all of the possible things he could have taken out of those reports, this is one of the details he actually had to go searching for to get correctly. How did he know the officers had a different detail to Stella Borges? This is a level of detail rarely seen from a hoaxer. And again, I'm not saying it's impossible, but wouldn't there be plenty of other options available throughout those reports that didn't require anything near this level of micro detail that he could have offered? Again, let's assume he did have that awareness and did indeed include that detail from the reports. So now he's well aware of and has access to all of these things police know about the scene. Let's move forward a little bit with this assumption in tow. Stilts' challenge in the newspapers prompts another letter. This one arrives under the ZODIAC moniker. His response to the request asking for more details? He brags about his electric gun sight. So with this exclusive, unlimited access to the reports, when pressed for more unique details, he offers nothing from those reports whatsoever, but elects to talk about something not even mentioned in them as far as we know. It's spoken about in a news article from the days after Lake Herman Road, though. He could have chosen to include a number of details like the class ring, the attire of the victims, without having been at the scene itself to further establish that credibility. But he bragged about his pen light. It seems to be more of a response to specific media statements about light conditions at the scene, and certainly not something I would expect to see from someone with access to police reports and all of the exclusive information within them. So, how about knowledge of this information from being at the scene itself? If the actual killer isn't Stella Borges, which of course it clearly isn't, then the only opportunity to be at the scene and relate this detail correctly without being the actual killer is having arrived after Stella Borges and before the responding officers, which would be about maybe a 3 to 4 minute window if we're lucky. Now, never mind the coincidental timing of the hoaxer, just happening to be in that same spot as the crime he's claiming later on, swooping in on scene details, weighing up the risks of doing this, he may as well have just done the shooting himself by this point to save all of that effort of detail scavenging. So this leaves us with the writer getting the information from other means, overhearing officers or reporters talking about it, maybe even smooth talking or manipulating these people into oversharing and the like. This scenario has many of the same issues as the one where the writer has access to the police reports. And I'll bring up the pitch from Stilts here again in the media, his request to the writer to give out more details. Why such a seemingly lame offering like the electric gun site for exclusive detail at Lake Herman Road if he could simply go and gather more detail off the street? We also still have the issue where only 3 people, the true killer, Stella Borges, and interviewer Les Lundblad, have that critical first-hand knowledge of Betty Lou's original body position, a small and seemingly inconsequential detail which becomes critical when determining who was at that scene and when. This limits the potential for ascertaining the detail from human means dramatically, as it's highly unlikely any of the other officers will even know about it, let alone consider it important enough to mention in passing outside of the investigation anywhere else. So why did he decide to talk about the electric gun site? Well, something that comes up time and time again, which we'll see as we move forward, is the letter writer responding to things written in news articles. As I mentioned a little earlier, law enforcement speculated on the light and his vision during events of that evening in the newspapers. They said he could see silhouettes illuminated on the horizon. I'd argue this is a much more habitually Zodiac thing to do, and it's something I'd expect from someone who was likely paying more attention to getting his bullets into his victims than trying to remember specific scene details. We don't even know if he'd planned to kill again at that stage. Why would he need to remember minute detail? The bodies would have been illuminated in his headlights as he drove away. Everything else would have been difficult to see and remember due to the poor lighting. So poor he couldn't even see what would have been corroborating details, like the colour of the victim's clothing, the ring grasped in David's fingers, etc. Through all this remains the distinct possibility he contacted law enforcement outside of public knowledge and proved his involvement that way. To summarise, I can't prove it's impossible for the letter writer to have claimed credit for Lake Herman Road without actually having done it, but I can't conclude that it's the likely scenario here. To be a hoax involves bashing a lot of square pegs into round holes. We simply have to ponder at what point does it become easier just actually doing the killing. He didn't go out of his way when claiming responsibility for Kathleen Johns, and he had a whole 4 months to gather unique details for that incident. That's the kind of effort we generally see out of a hoax, and we could say the same about the Riverside confession in the LA Times letter, really. It conveniently fell on his lap, and he wasn't in any way challenged to actually supply credible details. Imagine if he had been pressed. Part 2. Tragedy at Blue Rock Springs. For the purposes of this narrative, we are going to assume that Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs are one and the same killer and approach events from that specific perspective. Around midnight on the 4th of July 1969, the next attack in the series occurred, and like at nearby Lake Herman Road, the chosen location is an isolated area, a kind of lover's lane spot, and as the killer pulls up to the scene, we begin to see some subtle differences and deviations which have increased his chances of controlling the crime scene. According to Mike Mageau, they parked behind the victims, left the headlights on, and approached them with a large handheld flashlight in such a way that made them believe it was a police officer. In fact, the young victims were in the process of presenting their identification as the unknown man approached. At Lake Herman Road, witness James Owens stated he saw victims and killers' cars parked beside each other. Mike had rolled down his window, which seemed to be a conscious point for the killer, who acknowledged this very fact in a future letter. The windows were not down on the Lake Herman Road victim's car, and we can deduce by the ballistic evidence that it might have been a factor in the choices made there. Also, this time the killer had brought a bigger caliber handgun, a 9mm, with much more stopping power than the .22 used at Lake Herman Road, a definite upgrade in his killing tool. Another factor may have been the exact timing of the attack to coincide with fireworks celebrations and somewhat mask his gunfire. James Owen thought he heard a gunshot after driving past the Lake Herman Road scene, so timings at Blue Rock Springs may also have been a reaction to this evidence. It might also explain why the killer initially drove away and then returned, which happened according to Mike's statements. These improvements to MO gave the killer ultimate control over the crime scene. He had both victims defenceless, off guard, nowhere to run, all lit up like a Christmas tree, and no witnesses. Yet he still somehow fails to kill one of them. This is a bit of a teller to his weapon handling abilities, in my opinion, under duress, but that's a whole other topic for another day. So let's recap on things that may be some MO development in play here. Lake Herman Road, the cars parked next to each other, which means no illumination. Blue Rock Springs, the car is parked behind the victims, and the headlights are on, creating illumination of the scene. At Lake Herman Road, he uses an electric gun sight or pencil light taped to his gun barrel. At Blue Rock Springs, that's replaced by a large handheld flashlight. At Lake Herman Road, the victims are both shot outside the vehicle. At Blue Rock Springs, the victims are both shot inside the vehicle. At Lake Herman Road, a .22 handgun was used. At Blue Rock Springs, a 9mm handgun was used. At Lake Herman Road, witness reports say they heard gunshots. At Blue Rock Springs, the timing of the attack coincided with possible fireworks celebrations. Now, all of these refinements in MO are visible even without knowing exactly what went down at Lake Herman Road. It appears that the Blue Rock Springs perp has been deliberate in acquiring control of that scene, in contrast to the evidence presented at Lake Herman Road. These differences in scene management are able to be easily mitigated. We know serial killers refine their MOs as they get more experienced and see what works for them, and more importantly, what doesn't work for them. His failure to kill Mike at Blue Rock Springs doesn't belie his MO development. He'd done everything he possibly could have to give himself all of the advantages, and then he simply dropped the ball on the goal line. Let's put it another way. With these factors in mind, would you find it easier to believe that Lake Herman Road is the first one of a series, or that Blue Rock Springs is the first one of a series? The killer was blissfully unaware he'd left one victim alive at the scene as he entered the phone booth to call VPD. At this point, he was likely still fueled by adrenaline, though probably not quite as much as half an hour before. But when he picks up the paper, we can imagine his horror upon learning that one of his victims has survived the shooting. He's not well enough to be interviewed, but he is expected to recover. There will be plenty of emotions and turbulence invading the perp's headspace at this point, whatever his disposition. He'll be revisiting the scene in his mind, maybe trying to recall which details Mike might have seen. Did he see my face? My car? It might not have actually bothered him about being witnessed, but it sure would have bothered him that he failed to kill one of his victims. That was a competency issue that had to be addressed. When he picks up the paper on the 7th and learns that Mike couldn't identify his attacker, there will be plenty of relief and a renewed sense of determination. The press didn't give him front page coverage at any point, and that annoyed him almost as much as his failure to kill Mike. The first job is to rectify the press attitude towards him and his deeds. He decides to up the stakes by constructing a 3-part cipher, now known as the Z408, and mailing this with 3 identical handwritten letters, well, not quite identical, but very similar handwritten letters to 3 different news agencies, the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. He claims the solution to the Z408 contains his identity and demands the papers print his cipher on their front pages. The Z408 was a beautiful distraction. Zodiac would become a seed planted apparently out of a taunting curiosity, almost certainly provoked by some not-so-gentle persuasion from Jack Stilts, and it sprouted into a media persona from which the killer could project his nightmares and terrorize the people of the Bay Area, a public mask for his campaign of fear. Except it struggled to catch on outside his own fantasies in the beginning. None of the newspapers printed him on the front page, a disappointment he acknowledged when he sent the next letter on August the 4th, the 3-page letter in which "This is the Zodiac speaking" would appear for the very first time. We know for a fact he was coveting the front pages of several news publications because he had made it clear this was where he wanted to be. What he saw on the front page of these newspapers over the next 2 weeks quite possibly served as a kind of blueprint for how he himself could finally get that precious spot. On August the 4th, the frenzied knife murders of Kathy Snoozy and Deborah Furlong were featured on the front page of the San Francisco Examiner, among others. Their killer, Carl Werner, would not be identified until 1971, so this horrific crime was very much unsolved during the early part of Zodiac's reign of terror. A fact he tried to take advantage of in later communications, referring to the young girls' deaths in very ambiguous fashion. He knew that if he tried to claim them directly, nobody would believe him. He'd only killed people with guns up to this point, not by stabbing anybody, and he couldn't provide any credible proof of being responsible. Two things he would rectify at the next two crime scenes. On August 4th came the debut of Zodiac Letter. There are no threats of future violence here, merely more corroborating details and the pang of disappointment at missing the front page. Note at this point the quasi-friendly tone of the opening of the letter. Dear editor, I shall be happy to provide more details. Are the police having fun with the code? In the days following this letter, two things ramped up the stakes for Zodiac. Firstly, his precious front page spot was exploding with news of the terrible Tate LaBianca murder perpetrated by some of Charles Manson's followers. This included morbid messages scrawled on the walls in the victim's blood. If Zodiac had any doubts whatsoever on how to get himself on that front page, this surely erased them. It was clearly obvious he had to start using a knife and get up close and personal, also somehow leaving his signature at the scene. He wouldn't use victims' blood though. That wasn't his style. His most effective weapon was his marker pen. Secondly, at around the same time, news reports were emerging that a private citizen had cracked the Z408, and it would become clear over the next few days that the solution had been authenticated by law enforcement. So not only were others stealing his thunder in the papers, his precious code had been cracked by a schoolteacher. Nobody cared about him anymore, and his attempts to create his fearful persona via the letters seemed to be an abject failure. He now clearly realised he needed to up the stakes dramatically, and so it was on the 27th of September 1969 when he saw an opportunity at Lake Berryessa and put the next phase of his mission to reach the front page into action. Part 3. Terror at Berryessa. The need to be dramatic brought out a whole new level of creativity and ingenuity from the killer at his next chosen scene. This time, he has decided he is going to use a knife, just like the people who rudely pushed him off the front page. It seems clear this change of MO is a direct reaction to the media's inability to meet his demands. He's effectively saying, if you're going to put knife murders on the front page instead of me, I'll do some knife murders and force your hand. It'll also make you all think twice about my involvement in previous and future knife murders. It's interesting that Lake survivor Brian later speaks about the perp's tendency to react to the situation and how he let the conversation drag along a lot longer than he probably intended or wanted to, due to Brian's insistence to keep chatting and communicating. He only really took complete verbal control once his victims were tied up and helpless. Another factor was that because of his previous attacks in Lovers Lanes in and around the Vallejo Benicia area, there were far fewer people parking in the Lovers Lane areas and therefore fewer potential victims at this type of location. So he was almost forced to look at alternative MOs and methodology due to this fact as well. The writing on the car door seemed to serve multiple purposes: a direct link to the letters and his own symbology, extra shock value, as seen at the Manson murder site. There are likely other personal itches that this scratched. As happened at Blue Rock Springs, the killer placed a phone call to local law enforcement not long after the attack, claiming responsibility and directing them to the location. Again, he has clearly assumed both victims perished upon making the call, and realising the relative remoteness of the scene, he wants it discovered ASAP. At the Napa phone booth, we see another subtle difference that displays a level of awareness and learning. In Vallejo, once he'd replaced the phone receiver, it began ringing, apparently startling him. The operator had managed to trace the phone booth and called it. This affected him enough to write about it in his debut of Zodiac letter, claiming that a Negro witness had seen his car in the process. At Napa, once he had finished speaking, he simply left the phone dangling off the hook, possibly demonstrating that he had learned from previous incidents. As at Blue Rock Springs, he would have been fueled with adrenaline, probably more so with such an up-close and personal type of attack, where he gets the victim's blood all over himself. He'll be feeling quite good at this point and wanting to get back to his sanctuary, clean up and wait for the inevitable news articles reporting the genius of his work. Definitely from the front page this time, surely. Except, once again, far away from his perceived assumptions, both of his victims have survived the initial assault and are fighting for their lives in Queen of the Valley Hospital in Napa. It's possible he didn't sleep much over the rest of that weekend while waiting for reports to hit the newspapers. He probably would have been fully charged up, still blissfully oblivious to the final outcome and on out high. The first reports on the attack started coming through on Sunday evening in Vallejo. Any joy at his work being put on the front page would have been immediately blunted by the news that he had failed to kill either of his victims. Unlike at Blue Rock Springs, there had been a lot of interaction between himself and his victims, and they could potentially describe an awful lot of things about him. So now he had failed badly with the knife and made himself look foolish with the phone call and elaborate get-up. I seriously doubt he would have perceived things this way though. These types of killers apparently struggle to comprehend personal failure. He probably didn't reflect too long on it. As a reactive type of person, it does seem clear that the Zodiac was going to have to play the waiting game here. He would have been studying all of the different news reports carefully over the next few hours and days for sure. Sadly, he didn't have to wait long. News reports of Cecilia's passing away began to appear on the 30th of September. The relief would have been overwhelming, and he might have even got a surge of optimism about Brian suffering a similar fate. The next 2 weeks would have been a roller coaster for the Zodiac. He's reading about the physical evidence they have collected, and he'll also see that Brian's condition is stabilizing, and it becomes clear he's going to make a full recovery. This would affect his legacy of terror again. Were he to fail twice in the limelight, he'd have to correct that at some point in the near future for sure. Were 2 victims too much to handle? One would be easier. But another thing was apparently annoying him during this period of time. There seemed to be a distinct lack of respect and acknowledgement for his genius throughout the media. Nobody seemed to be taking him seriously, despite all of the creativity and flair employed at the lake. His inability to kill both victims was being highlighted. He was losing control of his mission. Nobody was acknowledging him as the Zodiac either. He was still being labelled as the Cypher Killer in news articles at this time. And all throughout this period, reports of Brian's improving condition served to up the anxiety levels. On the 10th of October, everything changed again. The news report stated that Brian was leaving hospital that very day and would return to his classes. This news would have been the catalyst, the backbreaker for the Zodiac. Having ridden the roller coaster for 2 weeks and watched the situation escalate out of his comfort zone, he was now once again in a position where he was being forced to take back control of the Zodiac narrative, and promptly. Part 4. Back in control. It's probably not a coincidence that Paul Stein was shot by Zodiac the day after Brian Hartnell walked out of Queen of the Valley Hospital. Whatever it was that prompted the killer to choose that specific part of the city, it seems clear to me that events of the evening were heavily influenced by those that preceded it. Zodiac had lost control of his own story, and he had to get it back pronto. Nobody was taking him seriously in the media. He'd left 2 survivors at his last 2 attacks. He'd not only failed to instill the fear and terror he had wanted, he'd apparently become almost as much of a laughingstock. What better way to take back the power than to leave a body in an affluent part of the big city right on the doorstep of SFPD? Location-wise, Presidio Heights was the riskiest, most high-stakes attack of the series. However, victim-wise, I believe Paul Stein represented the very next step of his MO. He'd struggled with multiple victims in set locations. Here we find a solo victim, one under his command who can take him wherever he chooses, complete an absolute control of the crime scene from the beginning until the end. There are many ways to interpret that, sure, but For the sake of this article, we're going to focus on whether there are elements of MO development. Again, we are assuming it is the same person that has done Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs and Lake Berryessa, followed the media about the cases and sweated over the errors and felt a sense of losing control. It appears as though he has now moved on from having his vehicle associated with the crime whatsoever. Remember, he makes a point about mentioning his vehicle being seen in the debut of Zodiac letter, and investigators have found tyre tracks where they believe the Berryessa perp may have parked. In fairness, this could be nothing more than a consequence of his victim selection. Rather than a lover's lane or isolated setting, he has opted this time to select a victim that can transport him literally anywhere he wants to go. In a taxi cab, he has full control over his victim by default. In his last gun crime, it is highly possible he timed the attack to coincide with fireworks, aiding and masking his gunfire. By doing this crime in an enclosed vehicle, he increases his odds dramatically of suppressing the solitary gunshot planned. The Blitz-style kill here was very much deliberate. He needed his victim dead for certain. He had to give himself every possible advantage and make the most of that advantage. One victim turns out to be a lot easier than two. I personally believe this is a deliberate piece of MO development. Two victims were apparently an issue for him, so he chose to lessen the risk, especially given a cab driver is occupied with operating the vehicle and utterly defenceless against any form of violent assault. You would struggle to find a more vulnerable adult victim than this, except perhaps a prostitute, and I personally believe the Zodiac would have been too intimidated by prostitutes. But digressing, had he exited the cab directly after shooting Paul, things would certainly have turned out differently. For starters, the famous composite sketch probably wouldn't exist. But no, he was determined to do something very dramatic, something that would etch him into criminal history, if not the front page of the newspapers at the least. He had to let them know he was deadly serious and not to ever be ignored or mocked ever again. That extra time he spends at the scene, that massive risk, came with many drawbacks. If he was planning on killing more people, just the cab keys with a letter would have been enough. There's a suggestion that the way he words this in a later letter, it's evidence that he literally planned on never being seen again. Additionally, we learned in 2020, thanks to that absolute legend Dave Oranchak and his team, that he felt he had enough slaves for his afterlife. Was he suggesting he'd killed enough people under the Zodiac persona? In the here and now, he is preparing to wage war with SFPD and the ignorant press. On the 13th, arrives the next letter, complete with bloody swatch of shirt, claiming responsibility. Handwriting experts confirm it, and when we compare the tone and the content of this letter to his previous effort, we see a big shift in attitude. Gone are all the pleasantries like, "Dear editor," and "I shall be happy to," and "I hope the police are having fun." He begins immediately with, "This is the Zodiac speaking," in a more visible and pronounced fashion. If you compare the size of the word Zodiac in each letter, for example, he then proceeds to get straight to the point before flogging SFPD's incompetence and threatening to assault a school bus. Plenty of threats going on now. This letter is much more decisive and blunt. He's now decided if he wants to be taken seriously, he has to be serious. And here, he truly is. He's desperate to regain control of the Zodiac narrative, and at this point, the media start to refer to him as the Zodiac. Finally. Yet it still seems as though dictating terms is not Zodiac's strength. The next action is once again a reaction. In some ways, the Mel Belli/Dunbar show incident was a watershed moment for the killer. People were impersonating him. They wanted to be him. After the 22nd of October airing of Melvin Belli, Zodiac prepared his famous Z340 cipher, in which he admits it was not him calling the Dunbar show and that he had had enough slaves for his afterlife. In the bus bomb letter, sent the day after the card containing the Z340, are some of his most upbeat offerings and signify what was effectively the pinnacle of his control of the Zodiac journey. When it becomes clear they're nowhere near identifying him and not solving the Z340 anytime soon, he decides to send that bizarre Belli communication. This happened to also be on the 1-year anniversary of the Lake Herman Road murders. Without delving too much further, I'm here mostly to cover the timeline in and around the murders themselves after all. I just want to point out his excessive use of the word control in that letter. This is interesting because deep down, control was always important to him, but I believe his main struggles were about how to remain in control. His persona appeared to have no logical direction, and it's almost as if most of his actions were simply reactions to the environment built around that persona. I'm sure he was thrilled that people were hoaxing and mimicking him, writing letters, making phone calls, adding to the confusion. It all helped to muddy the waters and make him harder to catch. When the Zodiac Killer movie hit theatres in April 1971, no authentic letters bearing the words, "This is the Zodiac speaking," ever arrived again. Had he achieved the ultimate recognition, his place in history, by being made into a film? So to summarise, I'm going to suggest that when Zodiac did Lake Herman Road, he may not necessarily have planned to kill more people and launch a campaign of terror through the mail at that point. It may have merely been some kind of release, one that grew on him as time went on, from some kind of trigger point. So 7 months later, when he does Blue Rock Springs and goes to claim credit for Lake Herman Road, his memory of some of the finer detail from the scene is limited, mostly because of the poor vision he seems to have had. The information he gave was about as good as he could give. It was dark, and so probably not feasible to recall certain things. He would know ammunition type, shots fired. He would know exact body positions when they lit up in his headlights upon leaving the scene, and his main thoughts would have been occupied with what went right, but more importantly, what went wrong. That's how killers learn and refine their MOs. Of course, it's impossible to know what was going through his head during any of this, and I could be completely and utterly miles away with my ideas and thoughts on it. But one thing I can guarantee is that there is a lot to be learned from absorbing the same material Zodiac was. I mean, we know for certain he was following the newspapers, and putting yourself in his shoes, trying to see things the way he may have seen them, by the way he reacted and developed his persona. This is how I've come to the conclusion that one offender and one letter writer is the most likely, most probable scenario. Without access to all of the relevant information and resources, we're simply never going to know for sure, but there's no harm in tapping into everything that is available and attempting to make feasible deductions based off it. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.